Call out's a fair call out. It's true. I don't do a ton of Canadian history. I recently started a new segment that I'm trying to brushen that up and brighten that up. I can show you all the. Okay, that probably wasn't the best example because it makes it look childish and like I'm not taking this seriously. This is going to be fun. I should probably face the camera for this. Hi, JJ. Good to see you. It was nice of you to call us out in that last video. Well, I mean, it was brief. You called out a lot of different Canadians on this one. So we have ourselves a Canadian YouTube feud. But I should be completely transparent to everybody who's watching this. So just so everybody knows, I actually know JJ McCullough. Outside of the interwebs, he's one of the few people that I have met in real person. He was like, one of the conservative people who was coming out to defend us on that whole front. So there was that thing. But then I started reading some of his articles and I started watching more of his videos and I realized that he is pretty painfully conservative, but he's different. He's unique in that he's very, very passive aggressive. So he makes all these videos and he writes these articles and he's kind of just one of the people who asks questions and cherry picks data and points out little things, and he's not factually wrong. And on Canadian topics, he's incredibly intelligent. He knows more about Canadian history than I do by a long shot. I would not debate him without doing a lot of research on a specific topic. All this being said, it's usually in a very passive-aggressive format. The videos he makes, they're all about, like a lot of them are, mostly on Canadian topics and politics, but he makes them fun. And you know how he does that? He makes them fun with this little trick. I'm going to say this right out of the gates. He could have started out with that a boot accent. Okay, I'm not going to put that past him. But when he moved to Vancouver and he's been here for a while, I'm pretty sure it would have softened. I posit, and I can't prove this, this is the feels over the reels, that he exaggerates his boots.
From a famous speech given by former Prime Minister Pierre Elliott Trudeau in 1992. It was a very famous speech back in the day. You can see in this book version, they describe it as the speech that rocked the country and stunned the entire nation. But it has been largely forgotten today, and I couldn't find it anywhere online, so I just scanned it and put it online myself. You can see the link in the thing below. Pierre Elliott Trudeau was the Prime Minister of Canada for most of 1968 to 1984. Aside from perhaps Wilfrid Laurier, the 8th Prime Minister, he was undeniably the most consequential leader that Canada ever had. Trudeau had a fairly authoritarian style, and he didn't always come off as a man who was clearly motivated by ideas. Like many...
None of this is incorrect, and to be frank with JJ McCullough's videos, it's not going to be like a Sargon of Akkad video where I pause it every 5 minutes and I'm like, well, that's just factually inaccurate. I'm going to pull up the actual statistics and bring them in. Like I said, he's going to give you some very truthful information when it comes to a variety of topics pertaining to Canada, but he will also be guilty of omission, and he will also, again, use this as a passive-aggressive way to just ask questions that actually push forward a narrative that he's trying to do.
He's claimed to be his underlying philosophy was a liberalism of individual rights. That is to say, the philosophy that argues that the ideal form of government is one that affords the individual maximum personal freedom. The government should protect an individual's right to live his life as he sees fit, and not subject him to oppression on the basis of the arbitrary preferences of others.
Okay, chat, you can't keep getting distracted by the homunculus. That may be a homunculus. He could be, I don't know, it could be homemade pickles. I'm not sure, all right? But we can't get distracted with that. That's not the purpose of this video. We have to stay on course.
One of Trudeau's most famous quotes about his philosophy came in 1967 when he was Attorney General. He was spearheading an initiative to liberalize some of the Canadian social policies of that time, including laws prohibiting same-sex intercourse. And this was how he described what he was doing.
The view we take here is that there's no place for the state in the bedrooms of the nation.
When Trudeau became Prime Minister, however, he created a much more lasting monument to this doctrine of individual rights, the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. This was a new addition to the Canadian Constitution that declared...
And personally, I'll say, in my opinion, because Trudeau did a lot of fucked up shit, but that's probably the best thing Trudeau did.
For the first time, that in Canada...
every individual is equal before and under the law, and has the right to the equal protection and equal benefit of the law without discrimination.
Okay, now flash forward to 1992. Trudeau is now out of power, and the new Conservative administration of Prime Minister Brian Mulroney has proposed its own package of amendments to the Canadian Constitution, known as the Charlottetown Accord. And he's going to put them to a big national referendum. 2 official languages, French and English. And then later, the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms also declared that Canadians who spoke these languages had special language rights. Lingual Canadians. I've already done a whole bunch of videos on this topic, so I won't belabor the point. But basically, the need to administer a state that does everything in 2 languages naturally privileges those Canadians who can speak those 2 languages, thereby creating a class of people with the collective right to run the national government forever. As his government put it at the time,
the legal and administrative discrimination in the treatment of Indian people has not given them an equal chance of success. It has exposed them to discrimination in the broadest and worst sense of the term. A discrimination that has profoundly affected their confidence that success can be theirs. Discrimination breeds discrimination by example, and the separateness of Indian people has affected the attitudes of other Canadians towards them.
Trudeau proposed abolishing much of Canada's existing Indian affairs bureaucracy, and instead suggested that the country move to some sort of new system in which Indigenous Canadians were governed by basically the same laws and institutions as other Canadians. Now, what exactly this meant in practice was always left a little bit vague, and in the end, Trudeau didn't even go through with it. In this book, he rather condescendingly says that the Indians were not ready for it. They were psyched out. A more honest summary would say that the Indians had come to appreciate the status quo, as bad as it might be in any number of ways, for at least being a system for protecting their collective rights as a distinct people. In any case, Pierre Elliott Trudeau ultimately ran hard in the other direction and explicitly put Aboriginal rights in the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. All of the centuries-old infrastructure for dealing with Indigenous peoples, including the Indian reservations and the treaties, and the entire legal category of status Indians, gained constitutional basis for survival, and survives to this day. Today, the collective right most aggressively championed by Aboriginal leaders and the Government of Canada is this idea that Aboriginal people have a right to self-government independent of the rest of Canada. You might have heard of the recent protests led by the chiefs of the Wet'suwet'en Nation of British Columbia. They said that they had the right to veto the construction of this big natural gas pipeline going through their asserted territories. And they said this despite the fact that there seemed to be considerable evidence that many individual members of the Wet'suwet'en Nation were actually in favor of the pipeline because of, jobs and so forth. And eventually, the Justin Trudeau administration settled with the chiefs. Going forward, there is supposedly going to be a lot more meaningful consultation about this sort of thing. Now, the fact that the
Well, I don't know much about this, but I am going to say that was not as smooth as I thought he would approach that incredibly difficult subject to talk about in Canada. It's not exactly something you could just have this short little 2-minute vignette on.
Because that gets to something that Pierre Elliott Trudeau specifically warned about, which is that collective rights usually just wind up being rights for governments. Since only a government can claim to speak on behalf of a collective group of people, collective rights inevitably make governments more powerful and individuals more helpless. Even individuals within that same collective. And thus, just as pushing the collective rights of the French Quebecers has made the Quebec government more powerful, so too has pushing the collective rights of the Indigenous Canadians made the many, many Aboriginal governments of Canada more powerful as well. Critics argue that this focus on consolidating the Indigenous collective right to sovereign government, which can often be a very long and legally complicated process, too often comes at the expense of improving the individual circumstances of individual Indigenous men and women. Unofficialized racial and ethnic minority groups in Canada lack a collective right to acknowledgement of their unique history and culture, and thus can only ever really be spoken of through analogies to one of the officially prioritized groups, in this case, the Indigenous Canadians. Check out this recent speech by NDP leader Jagmeet Singh, for example.
While we look to the States, this is not just an American issue. Here in Canada, we face anti-Black racism as well. Black people have died at the hands of police. We know that anti-Indigenous racism and deaths of Indigenous people at the hands of police is something far too common. So we have our own issues here in Canada, and we can't shy away from the anti-Black racism that exists.
Or how about this clip, right from the beginning of the speech?
Bonjour, good morning.
Even though his speech was entirely in English, he had to insert that bonjour because the French Canadians have a collective right to acknowledgement as well. Himself is an interesting case study of all of this. He is someone who doesn't easily fit into one of the higher order classes of Canadian and has seen his political career suffer as a result. For instance, it is often said that the fact that Singh wears a turban makes him very offensive to the cultural sensibilities of the French Quebecers, and this is the reason they voted massively against his party in the last election. That might strike you as extremely racist and awful, but it is also something that the Canadian left has had to sort of tread lightly around, including Singh himself. This is because they're all generally committed to the idea that the collective right of the French Quebecers to defend their culture should not be unduly undermined by outsiders' rights, which puts them in a subordinate position whenever the exercise of those rights comes into conflict with a group of more favored Canadians, which is to say some sort of government that is attempting to assert its collective right to uphold some sort of fundamental Canadian characteristic. There are a lot of Canadians on YouTube who do political commentary, but I have noticed that very few of them spend much time talking about Canadian issues, which is fine, I get it. A lot of Canadians on YouTube who do political commentary, but I have noticed that very few of them spend much time talking about Canadian issues, which is fine, I get it. Canadian issues are kind of boring and no one really cares. But I do think that this whole business of individual rights versus collective rights is an interesting one. So I am putting out a challenge to my fellow Canadian YouTubers, particularly those on the left. Is this a good system of rights we have in this country? Do you accept my premise that we are currently living in Pierre Elliott Trudeau's nightmare scenario, in which the collective rights of a few favored groups of Canadians possessing the supposed fundamental characteristics of Canada are allowed to triumph over the individual rights of others? Or is this maybe no big deal? What you all got to say, and I will...
Oh, fun. All right, well, let's start. I'll save you a little bit of time. You could have done this whole video in about, I don't know, how long is this going to take? I hate French people. I don't like French people. I don't like people from Quebec, and I do not want them to have any kind of legal provisions in Canada. What was how long did that take? I don't have a timer on me. I'm guessing that didn't take too much time, right? But that's basically the entire video. And then, like I said, he's not like other people on the right. He's not going to come out there and he's not going to say all these things that are outlandish. He's actually very, very factual, and for that, I respect the amount of Canadian history that was condensed into there. And you know what? A fair call out's a fair call out. It's true. I don't do a ton of Canadian history. I recently started a new segment that I'm trying to brushen that up and brighten that up. I can show you all the... Okay, that probably wasn't the best example because it makes it look childish and like I'm not taking this seriously. I am taking this seriously, but I'm just saying the difference between him and then most other commentators in Canada when it comes to this kind of stuff is that he's not exactly asking the questions directly, right? He wants to start a discussion. It was the same thing, and the reason I took a lot of umbrage when he brought up the abortion debate in Canada, of which there is no debate. There's not like an abortion. Even the conservatives of Canada are not trying to bring up abortions. It's just like it's a non-starter. It's not going to be very popular politically. It's just not something people talk about in Canada. They talk about it outside of the political arena, but even the progressive conservatives, they don't want to talk about abortions. And yet he's like, I just want to open up this conversation. I want us to talk about these kind of things. Can we just have this conversation? And that's what's a little bit insidious, is that he's going to cherry pick a whole bunch of things. He's going to put in his narrative. At the end, he's adding, I mean, by the end, things were kind of just mask off. He does not like the French. Federal provisions for the French-speaking people of Canada. Your political party will probably have a very big advantage in the federal levels. And that is entirely true. By doing this, Pierre Trudeau has in many ways secured long-standing rulership the Liberal Party has in Canada, due in large part to the fact that Quebec has 75 pre-census seats. Now, that's a lot of seats in Canada to win. If you win that, especially if you have a French-speaking prime minister or candidate in that arena, you will most likely perform very, very well. And so there's no question that is true. In terms of his criticism of the French-speaking language and people who speak French, je ne pense pas parce qu'il savait que je parle français, c'est pas du tout parce que non, il ne connaisserait pas. But the reason that he's bringing that up, just so you know, I went to French immersion school, and just so you know, it cost me this. It cost my parents this because they're public. Because our French immersion schools are public. That's part of the French immersion experience. So it's not a classist thing. I know he tried to point it out as a classist thing. Those who can afford to speak both languages, or those who have the time to learn both languages, it's by virtue of you wanting to put your kids in a French immersion school. It's free. It's part of our public education system. In terms of the fact that he says the left side of the political spectrum isn't able to talk about Quebec's racism, that's weird because, that shit you mentioned in relation to Quebec, that's racist. That's very racist. If you're not voting for Jagmeet Singh specifically because he happens to be Sikh, then yes, racist. I don't think that is entirely the reason why. I think they tend to gravitate towards towards one candidate more than another, but there's certainly an aspect of that, and I won't ignore that. I think that's horrible. I also think putting bans that are being done in Quebec on, say, women who wear certain religious garb, or just people who wear religious garb in general, I think that has undertones of racism as well. You're doing it specifically to one. You're doing it in the sense that you think it's going to directly blanket over one group of people, and that's in a lot of ways, yeah, it's not good. I don't support that. I don't endorse that. Stop doing that, Quebec. That's all I would say on that topic. You would have to tread very, very carefully in discussing, for the simple reason being that there's a lot of problems, not only with the history of colonization in Canada and the fact that most people on the left, I think at this point, are probably in favor of decolonizing these regions of Canada. That would be our solution to a lot of these problems, especially the one pertaining to their representation and self-determination. I think they should have autonomous control over the regions in which they live. And I think in this case, to say and to cherry pick that there is a certain population of people who wanted the pipeline to be built, of course there was. It wasn't simply young people, by the way. It was young people on both sides of the aisle, and they ended up bestowing the power within that of their hereditary chiefs. Whether or not you agree or disagree with that form of governance, that is on them to decide. That is not on you to decide. I wouldn't hear you saying the same things of other countries, right? And I'm not going to strawman you. You weren't specifically saying that we should go in there and change things, but someone wouldn't say that about, say, Pakistan. You wouldn't say like, hey, by the way, here's how I think we should change their laws and or governance. You have to think of it that way, even though it's so close to you in terms of proximity. Because if we want to talk about poverty, especially related to Aboriginal communities, and whether or not this was the big question that he wanted to ask, right? Is more rights being afforded to certain groups directly oppressing them? Is it basically putting them above other Canadians? Is there a hierarchy of Canadians that is created by this? And if you think there's a hierarchy of Canadians that is giving unfair advantages to the First Nations people, I'm guessing you probably haven't heard the stats. Get some things ready here so this works out. I want to do the same thing as you. Excuse me. The worst child poverty problem in the country was dropped in the laps of the country's premiers on Tuesday at the Assembly of the First Nations, presented to them with new numbers to show off half of Indigenous children live in poverty. Just as they did a decade ago. AFN National Chief Per Bellingard used the study written by researchers at the AFN and the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives to underscore the need for governments to invest in the First Nations community as the country premiers gathering in Saskatchewan for an annual meeting. What premiers were told overall is that 47% of First Nations children live in poverty. That's more than 2.5 times the national rate. The figure rises to 53% when looking at First Nations children living on reserves, and 4 times the rate of white children. Canada is not tracking First Nations poverty on reserves, so we did. Our children face the worst social and economic conditions in the country. They deserve an opportunity to succeed. Official poverty statistics don't examine the situations on reserves, except during census counts. Not tracking these figures, the study says, may muddle the statistics. First Nations, Métis, and Inuit only make up 5% of Canada's population, but in 2018, they made up 22% of the country's homicide victims. Of the 651 murders that took place in Canada in 2018, 140 were Indigenous people, 96 men, and 44 women. Holy shit. And while the number of male victims decreased for the first time since 2014, there were 6 more female victims of homicide than in 2017, marking a second consecutive annual increase. What about this one? An act of genocide. Canada's coerced sterilization of First Nations women. Canada's role in forced and coerced sterilization of Indigenous women has only begun to emerge within a more complex and historical context. As research continues to dig through historical records to examine the extent in which First Nations women were sterilized without their informed consent since the Confederation, a new Saskatchewan lawsuit has opened up another chapter in this shocking legacy. Garnering at least 60 additional reports in its wake and at least one verified case occurring as recent as 2017. So as of 2017, there was the sterilization of Indigenous women. The average individual household income of a total population was $29,796, but only $19,132 for an individual of Aboriginal ancestry, and a staggering $14,616 for an Aboriginal living on a reserve. This is from Mendelsohn, 2006. The poverty of First Nations has been the result of being stripped of their lands, their traditional livelihoods and cultures having been placed on less valuable lands as reserves, as well as a serious lack of educational opportunities. The resulting poverty, unemployment, low rates of education lead to food and water insecurity security, lack of housing and severe overcrowding, lack of infrastructure from sanitation or power, higher rates of preventable diseases like heart attacks, strokes, asthma, diabetes, and tuberculosis, which leads to hopelessness, despair, and corresponding higher rates of violence, depression, and suicide. Colonial laws and policies with regards to First Nations have changed little since pre-Confederation, and as such, an original policy objectives the eliminating of the Indian problem, in quotation marks, still underlie current federal policies. These federal laws and policies have not only placed Indigenous peoples in the current state of extreme poverty, but also keep them in a state primarily due to chronic underfunding of essential services, which even Canada's own officials have called discriminatory. Then focus on legislative amendments to the Indian Act program. The extreme level of poverty and its disastrous social outcomes have stumped policymakers for years, despite the fact that every major financial report has indicated that small investments now would have huge social and financial dividends later. For example, every $1 spent on Indigenous children now will save $7 in social programs in the future. This research is critical to informing future policy debates, analysis, and effective social changes in the future.
Hey friend, thanks for watching. Before we bombard you with all of our shameless links, we want you to bombard us. Do you have a worker co-op business or local union you'd like us to advertise at the end of our episode for free? So, if you'd like ears on your worker co-op, go down to weareserfs.com. And while you're there, join the Discord because it's filled with righteous guys, gals, and MPals. Finally, come check us out on Twitch Live 5 days a week by going to twitch.tv/thesurftv. Yeah. To our lords, Ricky Pilgrim, I'm Raft, Tomospone, Nine Tails Cosmic Fox, Hans Josephine, and Corpse Harvester, we bow meekly for your pleasure. To our Knights of the Round Table, Josh Mickelson, Dylan Byke, Zach Christensen, Todd Buckingham, Todd Lajeunesse, Clement Chetskoff, Cooper Pilot, aka the man with large balls, Political Puppy, Nick Davis, Ali May, and Alan R., we salute you. And to our many merchants and farmers, you have our undying loyalty.